Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this third installment of our Reimagining Systems series. As always, if you have any technical issues that come up during the program, please use the question bar, and the Council's Vice President for Programming, Haley Boyle, will try to help you behind the scenes. Later in the hour as well, we will be taking some questions from this audience. In order to pose a question to the speakers, please type it into the question bar. If your question's selected, I'll read it aloud to our guests. On to our discussion. We are joined today by Malik Neal, Director of the Philadelphia Bail Fund, Derecka Purnell, a human rights lawyer, writer, organizer, and columnist at The Guardian, Wilfred Reilly, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University, and Maurice Richards, a former police chief of Martinsburg, West Virginia. Welcome to you all. To start us off, I want to ask each of you to make a couple minutes of opening remarks. And I want to ask that you focus those remarks on a couple of questions, if we could, that I just want to sort of frame out real quickly. Last night, the opening night of the Democratic National Convention, saw many references by speakers to systemic racism in American policing. But it also featured Vice President Biden saying, quote, "Most cops are good," and that we need, as a country, to get rid of the bad ones. Is a different of the issue than, I think, the concept of systemic racism. So to start us off, my questions are twofold. First, in your view, each of you, is there systemic racism in American policing? Why do you think so, or why not? And then second, regardless of your answer to that question, if you could wave a magic wand and institute one reform that you think is important to American policing across the country, what would that be? I want to take that in the order of Malik, Derecka, Wilfred, and then Maurice, and then we'll go from there. So Malik, please.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Craig, for having me. When I was in high school, I participated in a lot of World Affairs Council events, and I never thought I'd be speaking here. So when I got the invitation, I thought it was a mistake, but I guess you can decide later if that was the case. I think first, I'd like to just begin by just talking a little briefly about my background, because I think it gives some context to what I'm going to say. You know, I've lived in South Philadelphia my entire life. It's a community that I think until recently was a place that you talked about but you didn't visit, you know, that you read on the news but didn't particularly live there. And, you know, I saw firsthand the trauma and tragedy of violence, particularly gun violence. And so I cared deeply about public safety. I cared deeply about protecting the communities that I grew up in. And I mention this not to give you a sort of personal history, but I think it's ultimately because of that experience, not in spite of it, that I don't believe policing is the answer to keeping us safe. I think to your point, Craig, that you mentioned, I think it's an interesting one, this whole idea of good versus bad cops. And when I heard Biden say that, it sparked that in me, because I actually think that misses the point. Like, we're not talking here about individuals, but institutions. And we know that much of the work that police do involves surveilling and arresting people for offenses that shouldn't be criminalized. And I think as a result, you get a lot of arrest and surveillance of Black people. And so we know that, like, of all the arrests that happen, only 5% are for what we would, you know, what we've deemed serious offenses like murder and rape and those things. And that 95% of the arrests are including minor things like marijuana possession, unlawful assembly. And I think it's interesting from a bail fund standpoint, because we provide bail assistance to a lot of people that police have arrested, and an overwhelming majority of those cases are even withdrawn before trial. And so I think this means that police spend most of their resources going after these sort of minor incidents that actually don't threaten everyday life, but do lead to mass criminalization and does lead to incarceration. And even by the numbers that we get, you know, a lot of these cases, when we talk about murder, rapes and those things, are uncleared every year. And so ultimately, police don't, and I would argue don't even have the tools to really address the root causes of these issues, and are more of a back end response. But, and I don't want to go on here too much, but I think it's also important too that we in these conversations sort of reassess what we mean by certain terms like crime, like violence, right? Ultimately, for example, I mean, when we talk about crime, like we don't track, for example, all the illegal stops that police do. We don't track, the crimes that police commit against citizens, and even how we determine what is a crime, right? Like it's, we see crimes happen a lot on college campuses, and they get one response as opposed to, Black communities not too far away. And I also think that, we already have communities with little to no police. They're called Bryn Mawr, they're called Paoli, they're called really any suburban neighborhood in America, where we don't have police patrolling neighborhoods, where we don't have people being arrested, where we don't have huge collections of people being sent to prison. And I would argue that the difference between those communities, the difference between my community and the suburbs, is ultimately, I think, a matter of resources. People in those communities have jobs, have access to housing, and those things. And I think ultimately, and I think it's been said multiple times, that those communities, the communities that are the safest, are the ones with the most resources, and not police. And I think just to end, and I'm sure we'll get into the conversation about this, but I think there's this whole sort of inevitability of crime in the quote unquote inner city, right? And I think we have to recognize that there's really nothing inevitable about it. These are policy decisions that we've made over time. And that, these aren't just violent places, but these are ultimately, it's ultimately matters of resources and those things. And so I think ultimately in this moment, I think we don't need sort of tired reforms. I think we've had body cams and we've seen Philando Castile killed. We talk about banning chocos and we see what happened to George Floyd. We talk about oversight boards and we see what recently happened in St. Louis with Darren Wilson. So I think in order to move forward, I think we're going to have to reimagine what we mean by violence, what we mean by public safety, and ultimately use that reimagination to move us forward and keep us safe.
Malik, thank you. Derecka.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, great.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you also again for the invitation. Very excited and curious about the conversation. I'll start just by answering some of the questions. And so last night, I didn't see a lot of systemic racism during the DNC. I saw a lot of pictures of kids hugging cops, which I thought was interesting, and went to ultimately back up what Joe Biden said about all cops. Most cops are good, and then obviously it's the inverse of the few bad apples argument. Most cops are good. And so for your questions, right, the first one was whether there was systemic inequality in policing. What's complicated to me about that question is to treat policing as an isolated institution in a vacuum, right? So it depends on what you think police do and what they consist of. And it's like, of course, there's systemic, racism in policing. Unfortunately, there's systemic racism in almost every single institution in America. So the policing as a force, as an institution, is not anomalous in that nature. It's not everyone is sort of moving along in a spirit of racial justice. And then we have police over here and it's like, whoa, what's going on? It's not as if it diverges from the systemic racism that's present in so many other institutions. So I think that's important to say. So unfortunately, what we have with police is the preservation of systemic inequality. Like, to me, that's what ultimately is so important. This is why when Joe Biden says that most cops are good, is, well, what good at what? Good for doing what? For what purpose, right? So if most cops treat homeless people with dignity and moving them from one part of the city to another part of the city, that says very little about the power and why people are homeless and poor in the first place. It just says that, see, most cops actually are very polite. They treat people very nicely. They help people walk across the street. But ultimately, what that does is still preserve the inequality. It preserves the people who still have no place to live. It preserves the relationships where you have an employer who's exploiting an employee. So you have police who are called in to manage crises of inequality, and then they do that violently because they have, weapons, they have guns, and they have tons of legal protection to use those weapons against people. And so it's not for me whether, there's systemic inequality within police, there's systemic inequality generally. And are we going to continue to use, an armed apparatus of the state to preserve that inequality? Which goes, I think, to your second question, which is, if we had just a magic wand and we could wave and create one and reform within, police, what would it be? So I push back a little bit. I wouldn't waive anything to change police. I think one thing I will probably waive is to abolish capitalism, because as long as we have a system that preserves inequality and makes sure that people can be exploited and that there's so much wealth and resources for the few, we're going to have police in order to preserve that power imbalance, right? Because right now, we just abolished police and every cop turned in their badge and their gun and just went home, and you kept Jeff Bezos and all the Amazon workers, they would just go take his stuff. And they should go take Jeff Bezos' stuff, because he should not have all of that money. It's not as if all of what he has built is completely, because of his intelligence, because of his smarts. He's not packing individual boxes. But what the institution of policing does, it keeps the property owners, and the stuff owners, the wealth, the 1%, it makes sure that they can live comfortably in society where they can exploit lots of people who don't have resources. And the people who don't have resources, not because they don't work hard, it's not because they're lazy, it's not because they're Black, it's not because they're women or differently abled or queer, it's because we have systemic inequality that is pervasive throughout this country, right? So when you think about the origins of policing, not only as slave patrols, which is making me very, very excited that history is getting some attention, but also as an institution that was founded mostly in the North to break up labor organizing. Well, we need police to break up labor organizing, because how else are you going to protect the property of the people who own the means of production? And so both of those histories, police coming out as breakers of labor organizing, and police as come out of slave patrols and looking to suppress Black resistance and organizing. I mean, both of those histories merge, and we see lots of that organizing still today. It's why the most recent endorsement of the police union for Donald Trump has just wait, what is going on? It's well, who is preserving the inequality in this country? Right? And who is being sent out to make sure that they can be funded to do that? So my magic wand, if it's truly magic, because some people say it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, but I would use my wand for that.
Thank you, Derecka. Okay, Wilfred, your view.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, you asked a couple questions there. In terms of one change I would make to the policing or the criminal legal system, that's very simple. I'd legalize drugs, virtually all of them. That you can say in a sentence. The second question of whether policing reflects systemic racism gets complex. I generally say no. But after a good point from Malik, I actually pulled up the most recent arrest numbers. And it's absolutely accurate that there were 1.6 million drug arrests, which is crazy. But there were also 1.1 million arrests for violent physical assault, 1 million for felony DUI, 400K for aggravated assault, 900,000 for felony theft, 500K for general violent crimes, domestic, etc. And those were heavily concentrated in poor and minority areas. So that gets into my broader point tonight, which is that we all, I think, oppose bad cops on the panel. But if we don't, in fact, want to abolish capitalism and set up a communist state, which I'd probably say no to, we have to recognize that police play an incredibly valuable role, particularly in high crime urban neighborhoods. And many of the reforms being proposed nationally right now would have a devastating impact on those communities. So this is especially true for any version of what's called defunding the police, which is generally defined as transferring large amounts of money from police departments to things like social services, or reducing the number of officers out there on the beat. And that idea isn't sort of a right-wing talking point. We've seen serious proposals around doing exactly this in cities ranging from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Aurora, Colorado. We've seen a New York Times lead editorial headline, "Yes, we mean abolish the police." And the idea that this would be a bad, illogical thing to do isn't really just an opinion. I mean, in my field, professional political science and criminal justice, we've seen this trend over and over, and the results have always been the same. So, I mean, during the mid to late 1960s, for example, the USA implemented a whole series of reforms designed to make the criminal justice process fairer to accused criminals, and actually designed to dig out some of the systemic racism and classism that probably had been part of that system. And in addition to some of those that we want to keep, like the Miranda rights, I mean, we saw the surge in so-called community policing. We saw the reduction in police force size. We saw the Escobedo addition to Miranda. We saw shorter sentences from the bench. We saw the expansion of the so-called fruit of the poison tree rule. And the result is that crime surged 600%. That's not an exaggeration or a typo. I mean, between 1960 and 1993, despite fairly modest population growth, the total number of crimes jumped from 3,384,000 to 14 million. Number of violent crimes went from 288,000 to 1,926,000. Rapes jumped from 17,000 to 109,000. And you might argue that that's because people became more comfortable with reporting crime or some such. But that wouldn't explain the surge in murders, which went from 9,100 to almost 25,000. And it wasn't until the modern era of what we call broken windows policing, what we call comp stat policing under mayors like Giuliani and Daley and the team in office in DC, that these numbers began to slant down again. That's just a documented fact. And every time we've tried these same techniques since the 1990s, they rise again. For example, James Comey coined the term Ferguson effect to describe the surge in crime following the Michael Brown protests in 2014, 2015. So after police began to pull back in response to demands from community leaders, which is again a documented, traceable phenomenon, murders jumped from about 14,000 to again 17,294 within just a few years. And tragically for me as a Black guy, this hit the Black community especially hard. So by 2018, if not earlier, we saw a situation where Black murder victims outnumbered all other murder victims combined, despite that second community of people being 6 or 7 times the size of the first. This is a true tragedy. So, I mean, that year there were 7,407 Black Americans, mostly Black men murdered. 94% of those guys were killed by other Black men. In contrast, there were only 6,088 whites killed and around 14,000 total murder victims. So much of this isn't the result of racism, except perhaps in the most vague and indirect imaginable sense. Those numbers didn't exist in 1960 when racism was far worse. This is almost entirely the result of specific police pullback in response to policies pursued by activists. So as a result of patterns like this, whenever we do research, the huge majority specifically of Black people don't want any major changes to their local police department, at least at the level of staffing. A recent Gallup poll, this is conducted by African-American social scientists, this was taken well after the George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks case, found that 61% of African-Americans want at least the same police presence in their communities, and another 20% want more police. That's 80+% of the Black community. And objectively, it's not hard to see why this is. I mean, we keep hearing about the endless list, if we're quoting the DNC, of allegedly completely innocent African Americans murdered by police, but that doesn't in fact jibe with reality. The George Floyd case was disgusting. We all want the officers responsible in jail. But last year, the total number of unarmed Black men killed by American Leos, law enforcement officers, was 15. For that matter, less than 60 people total, including whites, Hispanics, East Asians, who certainly face some prejudice, were killed by officers nationwide. To put that in some context, 89 people were killed by what's defined as bees, wasps, and stinging hornets, according to the CDC. So again, there are bad cops. I mean, that was the point made at the DNC that I tend to agree with. And I wouldn't necessarily describe that as a systemic problem. I see that as a small minority amongst police forces. And I'm really interested to see what suggestions a panel of this quality, I've read the work of Maurice, Derecka, some other people up here, comes up with for real reform. But I'll come, and as I said, I'll come right out the gate myself and say that I back everything from reshaping qualified immunity to legalizing drugs. But at seventh and last, I'm with the 80 to 85% of Black Americans who favor keeping most of the police we have now. And that's the perspective I'm bringing to the table today. I mean, obviously people can disagree on these things, but there are practical realities here. I mean, there are more police and more arrests in urban areas. This is true for the Irish and Italians in the past, true for African Americans, Puerto Ricans today, in large part because there's a great deal of crime there. Good reference made earlier to in Bryn Mawr in the suburbs, they don't have a great many police. They also don't have a large gang infrastructure in place and so on. I'm not necessarily sure applying those rules to Chicago would be a good thing.
Maurice, clean us up here.
Okay, I'll give it my best shot. Well, of course, the killing of George Floyd was terrible. It was a disgrace. It was totally wrong. And it was also universally condemned by every police organization and leader in this country. And our justice system acted incredibly fast in, holding those officers accountable. Nobody wants bad cops. And I'm telling you, as a police officer for 30 years, both in the city of Chicago and as chief of Martinsburg, that starts with police themselves. Do not want bad cops ruining that reputation. But as bad as that, and as terrible as that incident was with George Floyd, we have to put it in some context. There's more than 200 million contacts between police and citizens on an annual basis in our country. That's a lot. And, as bad as that one incident was, it is not indicative of a systemic problem, that needs to be eradicated there. Now, can policing be improved? Of course. And like I said, I've spent 30 years doing it. I've had a lot of success, and I hope we can talk about some of those ideas. But before we talk about improving police, we have to address the issue that you brought up, Craig, and that is systemic racism in policing. Nothing's perfect in this country, including police, but the myth of systemic racism is absolutely false in policing. And it's been perpetuated for a number of years, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, other activists, and really amplified in the media. And it basically came down to two things. One, that the claim that there is an epidemic of fatal police shootings of Black people that is based on either overt racism or implicit bias, and also that unarmed Black people are being hunted and shot down by police. Now, it's important to deal with this because as long as people in this country believe in this myth of systemic racism, you can see what the results are. The police become dehumanized, delegitimized, demonized, and you see the results happening on our streets right now. Mob violence that's getting more vicious every day, deadly attacks on the police, and a total upshoot in crime that's just, off the charts. So that's the result when people lose confidence and trust in the police. So what are the facts on these police shootings? Okay, every year, approximately 1,000 police or people in this country are fatally shot by the police. Last year was 1,004. 90% of those people were armed. 95% were either attacking that officer or attacking another person. Now, of that group, last year, 27% shot fatally by the police were Black. 55%, more than twice, were white. I guarantee that's a stat you never hear on the news. Now, critics of the police will point to the fact that 14% of our total population in the country is Black, So the question is, well, if there is a disparity, is that proof of racial discrimination? And what the data shows is that it is absolutely not. That the primary reason people get involved with deadly encounters with the police and there's a fatal shooting is because of their criminal activity. So, and that's across the board. It applies to all races. So if we really want to reduce the number of fatal police shootings in all races, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, you name it, then the best way to do that is not to commit crime. And we're talking about unarmed as well, and Will mentioned some of those. Yeah, last year, 15 unarmed Blacks were shot fatally by the police, 19 unarmed whites. Now, the first thing to realize is that just because someone is unarmed does not mean that they're not a threat. And that was proven very clearly in Ferguson, Missouri, with Attorney General Eric Holder's report showing that Michael Brown, 18-year-old, 6'5", 289 pounds, attacked a police officer, punched him, tried to steal his gun, had his hand on his gun, and ended up getting shot. So unarmed does not mean not a threat. So once again, if you look at the media, you would think that this is happening every day because of the selective reporting and constant streaming of these very tragic incidents. But once again, and as Professor Reilly pointed out, talking about bee stings, well, you know, I'll tell you how else this is so rare, or, you know, put it in a comparison. An unarmed Black person in the United States is 3 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to be shot by the police. That's pretty rare, but that's real. And that's not what we get from the media. So, and just a couple more points. You mentioned, and I want to, you know, address a couple things Derecka said about, you know, the history of this country. Yeah, it is not perfect. You know, we have a terrible history: slavery, segregation, racism, and all those things are true. And I'm not proud of the role that police have played historically in these things. Okay, I used to be before I was a policeman, I was a steel worker for 16 years. I was the head of Republic Steel Union, Local 1033. That's where the Republic Steel Massacre was back in 35. Okay, so I understand that police can do bad things. But the thing I think we have to realize is that we live in a country that's capable of incredible change and progress. And that's been the whole history of the United States, which makes us different than any other country on the face of the earth. We're not perfect, but we continually make ourselves better. Just a couple of things, and Malik mentioned, you know, talking about the different neighborhoods. And yeah, there's not a big police presence in richer neighborhoods because the crime's not there. Police are assigned to go where the crime is and where violence is. And as a lieutenant and sergeant, community policing sergeant, lieutenant in the Chicago Police Department, I probably chaired 100 beat community meetings in almost all entirely Black neighborhoods. And you know what the biggest complaint I ever got? I mean, and it was a complaint I got all the time, okay? But the biggest complaint was, how can we get more police? There aren't enough police helping us. And that is, you know, borne out by that Gallup poll. 81% of the people, of Black people, who are suffering and at the mercy of gangs and violence and that type of criminality, you know, they want the police, they want more police. And yes, police can do better when we can make it better, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. To Craig's point, what would I do if I could wave a magic wand? Man, I would increase funding for the police, because all the problems that we talk about, lack of training, you know, inability to communicate, you know, more transparency, better tactics, that doesn't happen on its own. You have to train people, you have to teach them, you have to hire the right people, and you're damn right, you have to get rid of the bad ones. But that costs money. So to defund the police, get rid of the police, I tell you, if anyone doesn't have an idea of what a world without the police would look like, all you got to do is look at Seattle, look at Portland, Look at Chicago and what's happening there. And that's not the kind of future we want for our country.
Thank you, Maurice. All right, obviously we've had a number of really important issues laid out with different points of view. Derecka and Malik, I want to come back to you. You've heard this argument. I know you've heard it before tonight, obviously, probably many times, that the police use of force against African Americans in far greater numbers than the percentage of African Americans in the population is simply because there's a disproportionate degree of criminal violence among Black Americans, homicide being the leading cause of death for young African American men. So in other words, the argument is the police are just doing their job, and that's what the statistics reflect. Can you comment on that argument? Derecka, let me start with you.
You hear me?
No, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, those arguments are frankly boring. Way back, even in law school, I remember those, critiques being lauded against. This is just what the police is supposed to do, right? There's so much homicide in the Black community. This is why we need more police. But if you look at St. Louis, if you look at Chicago, if you look at any of these cities with Newark, New Jersey, where there is, these high homicide rates, there's usually also high policing. So if all this policing is supposed to work, it's not because of dearth of funding, it's not because there's not community support for it, as Wilfred and Maurice has both supported. So why is it that there's already trillions of dollars over time have been spent on policing, and then there's still the same level of homicide rates? If the police are just doing their job and they're so effective, then why? I don't understand the disconnect. Miriam Kaba, as an organizer, she works on criminalization issues. And she says that, if you organize in Chicago, you will get a $2,000 grant and it'll go, here you go, fix violence. That's what organizers get. But police officers get billions of dollars and have gotten billions of dollars for several decades at this point, trillions if we accumulate it, if we add it up all together. So how is it that with that enormous budget, they still fall woefully insufficient in trying to combat the homicide rate, the murder rate, the crime rate? So that's one. I think the second point around Black supportive police, I always try to talk to people in my family, talk to people I organize with, especially as a lawyer. And what I typically hear from the community is something like this. If our options are something or nothing, and the police feel like something, then yes, we want more of something, because Black communities have already been seriously decimated. So the idea of removing one of the last institutions that's funded, often well more than education, more than economic programs, more than any of these other programs that could help, if funded at the same level or beyond policing, could probably undo that level of harm and violence. But the institution, the last remaining institution that gets funded is police. And now you want to take that away from us? It's the same people who express support for community policing. So if you've been tear gassed, if you've been experienced militarized policing, community policing sounds great. It sounds wonderful. Of course I want more community policing. It sounds fantastic. Do I want people playing, hide and seek with my kids, or do I want police on top of tanks pointing snipers at them? So when your options are nothing or something, or if your options are militarized policing or community policing or warrior policing or guardian policing, all of that, right? That's the poles that people are choosing between, which unfortunately, unfortunate. And so when I hear scholars or, law enforcement affirm the ideal legitimacy of police because of the unfortunate opportunities that's been offered to the people who's been surveyed, it shows that the data is insufficient, is unconvincing, and is boring, right? So if we ask those same communities, would you rather have billions of dollars for your robust education program? Would you rather have billions of dollars poured into a robust jobs program? Would you rather have universal housing, universal health care? It's interesting how all of the statistics for supportive police all of a sudden magically appear in conversations. But when Black people express, they demand money for jobs, demand money for schools, demand money for universal health care, all of those statistics just become footnotes. So imagine if we funded all the other things that Black people have been demanding for years, like what would happen? So I try to describe policing like hot pockets, right? Because Hot Pockets are a very, very, very nasty dish. I don't know if you had to eat them as a kid. I had to eat them as a kid. If you put them in the microwave, there's a frozen block in the middle after the timer goes off. And at the end, it's like lava. It's oozing out the sides. It's disgusting. And so the police are always there, and they're hot, and they're doing a lot. There's constant surveillance. They're patting you down. They're sexually assaulting you, or they're frozen. They're nowhere to be found. You call, the response times are limited. And so if you've been socialized your whole life that police are supposed to be here to protect and serve, now your response is, I just want them to do their job. Which is why the work of cultural workers, organizers, and abolitionists is so, so important, because they're reframing what, police actually do. What does they actually do? And we're talking about people who are vulnerable to partner violence, to violence from their kids, to violence from their neighbors. People, when I hear, say, this is what the community wants, the DOJ will often say that in Ferguson, when I was a lawyer working with that community, this is what the community wants. But there was an entire half of the community who also was saying, fuck the police. But no one went to go and have sit down conversations with that part of the community, right? All those people who were evicted and retaliated against for protesting, no one went. There was no Gallup poll. There was no knocking on those doors. There was no engagement with people who were dispossessed. There was none of that, right? So what's interesting now is there's a mass movement that's showing, some level of public shifting or public consensus around police violence. And I was like, oh no, but this one particular Gallup poll, right? And so I frankly at this point find those conversations a little bit boring. And Maurice, I appreciate your story about being a steel worker and talking about, the unfortunate effects of police violence on white people. I would say that I disagree. I deeply care about police violence against white people. To me, it even shows like absolutely why we need to abolish the police and reduce their capacity to do harm. Even white people are being killed. My critique of people who are sometimes Black Lives Matter activists, and I'm one of them, is that if you think that the police who are killing poor white people are going to magically care about poor Black people, that's a mistaken tactic. It's so unfortunate that for poor white people all over this country, enter into the police profession is the only way they can get a good job. So I deeply concerned and deeply care about the impact of policing on white people, poor white people, immigrant people. It's just so unfortunate that those stories aren't told. And I think that those stories were told more accurately, there would be more support among white people to abolish the police. And the last thing I'll say, because again, it's just unfortunate the level of disengagement with the history of, activism against police violence, which is there's this idea that police absence is police abolition. And I just want to know who argues that. Just because the police aren't present in a particular place, I know someone mentioned the Ferguson effect. Police not doing their job is not the same as police abolition. Police not being located in a place is not abolition. I disagree that suburbia even is police abolition. It's as if you all were in the 1700s and you walked into a city and all the slaves were away. You wouldn't say that, oh, slavery has been abolished. You would say that I don't see any slaves, which is different than the abolition of the institution. And so I find it quite boring to engage in a conversation around whether abolition is just being conflated with inaction or absence. Because all of the actual scholars who study policing work who are abolitionists, none of them have made the case. So you're arguing against something that you're not even engaging with the theoretical underpinnings of. And so now I have to respond to the quick talking points on top of apparently the history not even being contextualized. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think, Derek, I don't have much to add, except I do think when we talk about the Black community, I mean, I'm sure many of you have read James Foreman's work, which actually looks at this very issue, right? And we see that in Washington, D.C., many Blacks were actually calling for more resources, calling for more investment in the community, but the only choice they were given were more police. And so I think when that is the choice, it's very clear, it's not really a choice, right? And so I think we have to really consider those things, and that we actually have examples of that happening every single day, where constantly communities are calling out for resources and aren't getting them. All they're getting is more police.
Oh, But, just a couple of things if I could respond. And Derek, you talked about my experience. Yeah, the point I was trying to make is that, yeah, as a country, the United States is far from perfect. But what is unique about our country, and one of the things I love about the United States, is that we have a system that can be self-reflective, that can self-critique and make things better. Yeah, do we have a history of slavery? We do, just like every other society that's ever existed on the face of the earth. But what's different about the United States is that we abolished it. We fought a civil war to eliminate it. And we have to keep working continually to make sure that that dream is realized of equality. And I believe that this country can do it. You mentioned, about, the statistics. We're talking about the increase in homicides. And you mentioned that, you're bored by those arguments. And I got to be honest, I was a little taken aback to hear that, because I worked in Chicago.
I didn't say that I was bored by the statistics. I'll say I was bored by the lack of engagement with what abolitionists are asking for, and the lack of understanding the underpinnings of that. I'm not bored by the fact that people are being killed. I'm bored by how the argument to support the lessening of those homicides is being engaged. So I just want to make sure that those things are not conflated, because that's not what I said.
All right, well, I appreciate that, because I was part of during most of my career in Chicago, which spanned 24 years, from 91 to, I'd say, about 2001. There was because of the type of policing that Chicago did, along with New York and other places, where it became very targeted, not militaristic, but science oriented, putting police where the violence is, finding, the violent criminals, taking guns off the street, maybe 5,000 illegal guns a year in Chicago. And the results of that were amazing. I mean, there were probably 10,000 Black lives saved during that time. It went down 52% in terms of homicides. And that wasn't just, hard-nosed policing, but also working with the community. Most homicides, way most homicides are solved, and it's not like, watching TV with the crime shows. It's not done by forensics or anything special. It's by people giving you information and about who that killer is, and people that giving information about who is destroying their own community and their own kids. And the only way you get that is through building trust. And that trust was built, and the response, the results were amazing. And once again, don't want to beat a dead horse, but if we're talking about eliminating the police as an institution, which granted can be improved, if we're talking about getting rid of it, you already can see in this country what it looks like when you don't have the police. And it's nothing but vicious mob violence, whoever's got the biggest, club, the biggest gang, or the most guns. And that's not what we want to descend into.
All right.
Maurice, would you mind responding to my point? Can you actually just let me know if
Wilfred,
you've read any significant abolitionist scholarship? Because that's not what abolitionists argue. So I'm curious about your engagement with the literature of all of the theorists and practitioners around the role and purpose and function of abolition, because no one's, I'm like, you're responding to something that I don't hear myself saying, but it sounds like you're responding to something that feels like some sort of consensus. So I just want to make sure I'm hearing you clearly.
Well, I would say, the way I see, the argument of abolishing the police, I mean, to me, I'll be honest with you, that's a very idealistic point of view, because I believe that, and I think I got a different take on you, that, yeah, this is not a perfect society, but to totally abolish capitalism and replace it with, I'm not sure what you want to replace it with, but, that, the only thing the police do are, to enforce racism, inequality, exploitation. I just don't see it like that. And that's not been my experience.
Can I jump in here?
Let me jump back in. I want to come to you, Wilfred, and you can respond quickly, but I want to put another sort of item on the table. So you talk about systemic racism in policing as as a sort of a myth based on the statistics that you put forward. My question is, doesn't that argument, sort of statistical argument, ignore the extraordinarily broad consensus in the country about the lived experience of the relationship between African Americans and American policing decade after decade? To cite just one example of what could be, limitless, numerous examples, Republican Senator from South Carolina, Tim Scott, goes to the Senate floor a couple of years ago and speaks painfully about multiple times in which he's been harassed, in which he's been filled with fear in encounters with police who didn't know who he was. They just knew he was a black man. The question I pose to you is, isn't it obvious that sort of on average across the country, black citizens as a group are being treated as potentially dangerous criminal suspects by the police, and therefore there is excessive force, even when it doesn't lead to somebody being shot?
Okay, so I can respond to that. I can respond to that in some detail. It's a good question. I'd also like to respond to a couple of the other things that were said here. So first of all, as read Derecka's point about why, the question is, why is there a great deal of crime in large, potentially dangerous cities, even though we have police? That's something that in my sort of short opening statement I tried to deal with. And the answer is, if we didn't have police, there'd be far, far more crime. And again, we tried this in the 1960s. This wasn't just a theoretical change of the ideological underpinning behind departments. We cut police forces. Murder jumped from 9,000 a year to 25,000 a year. This is a bad, failed idea we've already attempted. And by the way, as read some of the sidelines, I also got to enjoy Hot Pockets as a kid, but I preferred ramen if you're talking about terrible food. But going on with this, the idea that we don't spend money on resources other than the police is simply bizarre. While we were all talking, I actually pulled up the Illinois educational expenditures, like money spent per kid. And when I went to school, this was about $6,000 per student. I was surprised to see that in Chicago, this had grown to $13,077 per student. Typical classroom with 24, 25 students receives $326,000 in funding. So the United States government is a behemoth. It's one of the largest, best funded entities in the world. We can discuss some discrepancies between black and white neighborhoods, but again, the poorest, least funded schools in Illinois are all in poor white areas. I'm glad to know we all care about that group as well. But the short answer is we've already tried to see what happens when we remove police from cities. What happened was a lot of dead people, mostly black. And I will say, for Derecka, you said this extremely well, but you seem to want a communist society, essentially. You've said things like, what about universal housing, universal guaranteed college, universal health care? That is kind of the great rival. If you would identify as a communist honorably, that's fine, but I don't. So within the capitalist society in which we currently live, structures like policing and so on are probably going to be there for a while. We can debate that for years. Now, as we read the question about systemic racism, first of all, I wouldn't deny that systemic racism I wouldn't argue systemic racism never exists. I mean, we had Jim Crow in the South until the 50s. Residues of it remain today. But the question about, generally when people make a weak argument for systemic racism, not that anyone on this panel has made a weak one, what they're saying is there's a gap between two groups, and I'm going to attribute that to racial bias. Ibram Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist, since people have asked, have you read The Lexicon on the Left, openly says this. He says if you see a gap between people or groups in terms of performance, you can either assume deep-seated, he means genetic, inferiority, or you can assume some sort of racial prejudice. It turns out that's not real. I mean, in quantitative political science, the reason I talk stats so much is that we find that adjusting for situational and cultural variables, things like median age, where you live, crime rate, eliminates many of these gaps. In the case of policing, I mean, Craig, your question was, doesn't the fact that the average black person has somewhat different experiences with the police than the average white person indicate systemic bias in police forces? I would say there are two responses to that from people that take the no position. The first is that Americans very frequently feel, as part of their lived experience, things that are not true. I'm working on a statistical project around COVID-19 right now, and I was absolutely amazed to find that the average American, a college-educated, white or black American, believes that 9% of the country has died from COVID-19. You guys can Google this. What percent of the population do you believe has died of COVID? This is the same kind of thing you see when you talk to college students or to young African Americans about policing. If you ask someone, including spokespeople like Chair Obiko, who said this on TV, if you're debating Black Lives Matter, how many unarmed brothers are killed annually by the police? The most common answer from my students is about 5,000. When you actually point out that that's 15, that does dramatically change people's perspective. First of all, the second thing in terms of why Black people encounter the police more is a complex relationship that has to do with this crime data we're talking about. So according to the BJS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the African American violent crime rate, again, as of last year, was 2.4 times the white violent crime rate. These aren't police numbers. I frankly think the police numbers around some things like drug arrests can border on the fictional. But these are crime reports from victims who outline the description, the race, the gender, so on, of the person that attacked them. The Black rate was 2.4 times the white rate, just as the male rate is 10 times the female rate. Because of this, there are more police in Black areas. So if there are more police in Black areas, more Black people are going to encounter the cops. As a young man in Chicago, growing up in one of those classic African-American, Italian-American, Irish-American neighborhoods, Bridgeport on the south side, later moved to East Aurora, we saw the police a lot. I didn't find that they were any nicer to white guys, or what at the time we would have called Spanish guys, than to Black guys, but there were many of them because we had a ton of crime on the south side of Chicago. There's no excuse for police officers ever bullying or slapping around or abusing African-American citizens of this country. But the only way you're going to get that excessive police presence out of Black neighborhoods is to reduce crime. On average, Asian Americans say they encounter nearly as much bias, mockery, being teased about driving, bullying in school, as Black Americans do. There is no narrative around a conflicted, mutually violent relationship between Asians and the police because there's almost no violent crime in Asian American communities. I'm sure there's illegal gambling, there are other offenses, but in a typical large city, in Chicago, I'll close with this. If you go to a site like Hey Jackass on the sort of the site right, that's the name of the site, or the Chicago Defender, great Black newspaper over on the left, and you look at the percentage of murders in the city that involve an African-American shooter, it's between 76 and 82 every year. And there are lots of white and Hispanic criminals in Chicago. So until that changes, I think you're going to see more police in Black neighborhoods. And if you have 2.4 times as many cops, you're going to have 2.4 times as many interactions. I don't think that makes the police systemically racist. One last note here, by the way, there seems to be an assumption that police forces are mostly white. Many of these large urban departments, and I mean, you can go into stuff, can Black people be prejudiced against Black Americans? But then you'd have to demonstrate to me Black officers are. And that's been attempted several times. That's never been done. In many of these cities, DC, LA, and New York, I would suspect New York's right on the line, you have a majority Black police force that's or majority Black and Hispanic police force that's interacting with a majority minority population in what are very often successful minority cities, Atlanta, Detroit. It seems simply odd to brand this as white systemic racism. There are a lot of cops in Detroit because there's a lot of crime in the D.
Derecka, I want to come back to you, and this will be the last question from me before we turn to questions from the audience. And obviously, I realize both to the panel and to the audience that we've barely scratched the surface of these really important issues. But hopefully, we've whet the appetite of the audience to go read and learn more of all these perspectives. But Derecka, back to you. I want to give you the opportunity to lay out a little bit what the vision, for those who haven't read the literature, what does the vision of abolition actually look like?
Oh, wow. So this is going to take much longer than, I guess, like the 5 minutes.
The short version.
The one to lay out like any other theory in 5 minutes. I think the microwave version of it, since we're going with hot pocket analogies here, is that abolitionists are theorists, organizers. I mean, theorists, organizers, scholars, practitioners, people who get to solve the root causes of harm, who are looking to have just relationships between people, between each other, between their employers, between their community, between the planet. right? So people who are against the abolitionist project, it's as if you're against the idea that people should not be able to have just relationships in this country. So that's like the big overarching view. So all over this country, people solve conflict without police. And so one thing that some abolitionists are saying is, well, what are the ways that people solve conflict without police and without prisons? How do we invest in those, right? This other idea that crime only exists or exclusively exists or disproportionately exists, in Black neighborhoods actually speaks to Malik's point that crime is also a social construct. What we decide a crime is becomes a crime. There's tons of harms that are not crime. So abolitionists are not only against the criminalization narrative, we're also against actual harm. I'll give you a quick example. In law school, we studied, women who initiated sex with their husbands because they didn't want to fight later. So a cop cannot solve that problem. You know why? Because cops are not equipped to solve that. And in a society where the harm would be something like rape, this is a gray area that women all over this country enter into these relationships and initiate sexual contact to avoid violence later. That's not consent. That's not desire. But abolitionists are trying to figure out, how do we create a world where people can have freer, better, healthier sex? Cops can't do that, right? One reason why people kill people, for example, is because of toxic masculinity. It's because of homophobia. It's because of transphobia. It's because of territorial disputes. Cops cannot make anyone less transphobic. They cannot make anyone less homophobic. If anything, if we look at police departments, they have a history of making homophobia and transphobia worse. The police department that killed George Floyd had the reputation at one point as being the most homophobic police department in the country. And so we start asking the hard questions of, why do people sexually assault people? Why do people kill people? That's how we get to the root of the root causes of harm. And so for police to say, never mind, don't ask those questions, we'll just show up with a gun and solve it, and we'll show up inconsistently based on what neighborhood you're in, or we'll show up disproportionately in what neighborhood you're in, that doesn't stop people from killing people. And usually the cop is there, someone's already died, someone's already hurt, someone's already raped. So how do we create a society where there's less overall suffering, where there's less preventable harm? And the last thing I'll say really quickly, because I think Wilfred, you said my name a couple of times, but you're responding to things that I don't hear myself saying. So I don't locate disproportionality to give a measure for racism. One reason why I don't do that is because what white people have in this country is insufficient for me. It's insufficient for the people I organize with. I don't look to see, well, there's a disparity there, so let's locate racism there. Because as I said to Maurice, I think it's tragic that police kill white people too. I think it's tragic that poor white women are being arrested at astronomical rates because of the drug trade. So I don't typically just look at the gaps to say, oh, look at that, this must be so harmful. I think sometimes it can be useful. But the reason why I think police violence is so problematic is not even reducible to police killings, right? So the disproportionate argument is at least not enough for me. It's not something I've said here. It's not something I try to espouse. I think the overall institution is inherently violent. And I think that we can have much better. Now, to say that we tried all of that in the 60s, you're again conflating police absence with abolition. And that's not what I'm saying. I don't hear Malik saying that. That's not in the literature. And so I understand the impulse to try to preserve the institution. I understand the impulse.
Do you think there would be fewer murders if there were no cops?
What'd you say?
Do you think there would be fewer murders if there were no police?
It depends on the context of the society. So in other countries that have significantly fewer cops than America, there's significantly fewer murders. We know that. You should know this. We're political scientists. And so it depends on the context of the country. It depends on the context of the laws. It depends on the context of inequality. So if we look at countries in Europe, there's significantly fewer guns, significantly fewer cops, significantly fewer inequality, and there's significantly fewer murders.
Well, you've got the issue there, and that's obviously an intelligent point. The issue there, though, is that the direction causation goes would be the question. So you're absolutely right. Like, a couple of you have brought up Mayberry-style suburbs, and you've said, well, in Bryn Mawr, great little place to visit. So I think that might have been Malik's example. But in Bryn Mawr, AOC, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez said this recently, in Scarsdale, there aren't many police, and there's not a lot of murder. That is a directional question. So you're absolutely right. In countries like Sweden, which are tiny, 10 million people, ethnically homogenous, upper middle class, you know, same established population for millions of, or for thousands of years, so on.
Yes.
No, but I mean, Sweden is seeing a crime surge now. They're among the world leaders in rape after mass immigration to the country. So they're going to see more cops now. But when you look at tiny homogenous countries like Estonia, and you say, well, they don't have a lot of police and they don't have a lot of crime, they didn't have a lot of crime first. In modern Detroit, or for that matter, West Virginia,
the reason why they didn't have a lot of crime
is if you get rid of the cops, you're gonna have a ton of crime.
So you're using you're decontextualizing the present and then trying to contextualize the historical. The reason why they didn't have lots of crimes because what begets those countries is drastically different than what begets the United States. And so you can't say, well, those countries haven't had crime since their inception. Well, that's because pillaging the indigenous people there was not criminal, right?
Really, you can just adjust for things like size and ethnic diversity to see how much crime a country is going to have. It's one of the easiest things to do in political science. Like, I'm enjoying debating it, but if you adjust for size, diversity, cities, you would expect the USA to have a ton of crime. So since we're in the demographic of countries like Russia,
diversity means like the people of color are criminal. Unless the diversity just means inherently people of color are criminal.
Diversity just means having people of different types. If you're a country like Bosnia that has people of different types, you're going to have more innovation, more patents. That's going to be great, but you're also going to have more war and conflict. Thus, the need for more cops.
Well, there's more war and conflict because people are criminalized, and so that's what it's okay. We can continue, Craig.
Okay. I'm going to jump back in. I actually think we've done a remarkably good job, given how heated this topic is in our country at the moment in being civil with one another. But we have a couple questions from the audience that I want to turn to before we have to end. So the first one is for you, Maury. We have a question that says, you've said a couple of times here that the country isn't perfect and we have to address imperfections. Wouldn't it be more sense, the questioner asks, to fund proactive community services like homeless services, mental health services, better funding for education in order to address the root causes of these issues rather than the reactive response of policing?
That's a great question, and those resources need to be put out there. But when we're talking about root causes, we didn't get a chance to get to this today, and I think it's probably a topic worthy of a whole nother program. We talk about these terrible social problems, including crime, and the assumption is that the police are either responsible for solving all this or not. And the police do make a very positive impact in knocking down crime, which we have to do. But the bottom line in crime, it comes down to people making personal choices to commit crimes. And where do people learn? Where do people internalize a moral value system that you either do right or you do wrong? And that starts in the home with the family. And so one of the things that hasn't been mentioned, but I think you have to, and President Barack Obama, when he was still a senator in 2008, and I remember it well because I was living in Chicago at the time, on that Father's Day speech, when he talks about the problem of fatherless families, of all fatherless families, of all races, but particularly in the Black community. And these are stats that are across racial lines, that a child growing up in a fatherless home, 5 times more likely to end up living in poverty, 5 times more likely to commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. Now, those are huge numbers, and no amount of policing is going to fix that. So I think those are the things when you talk about systemic problems. Yeah, that's a systemic social problem. The reason it has such an impact on the Black community is because right now across the country, 75% of Black children, Black babies, are born into out of wedlock families with no father, and that's up to 85% in the inner city. And once again, this is not a Black problem. It's 25% for whites, and you'll see the same, criminal results in families and communities that experience that as well. So it's something we need to look at.
Malik, I want to bring you back in, ask you to respond to what you've heard about this sort of argument about root causes. And then I also want to pose to you a question from one of our audience members that says, how do we engage in creating a healthy dialogue on these intense issues with our communities at home?
Yeah, let me first, can you all hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I think let me first just mention the whole idea that the reason for crime or a reason we have an uptick in crime is because of Black men not being in the house is just like, one, like if we're going to talk statistics, it's just not factually true when we had declines in crime and increases in fathers. But also, I'd like to ask the question, why do we think fathers aren't in the home, which is another question we can get into. But I also think the idea that we've been talking about before is I think what Derecka and others, I think what we're trying to point out is that we're seeking sort of structural solutions and building something in place of these punishment bureaucracies that we have that actually meets people's needs, that actually gets to those issues, and which Maurice readily admit police can't do. And so I think we have to ultimately envision and work toward building and asking those questions and getting at those institutions that actually solve those problems, which police, as Maurice said, just can't do. But I think I ultimately think the way we have discussions about this is just, I think history plays an important role in terms of how we got here, but I also think being brutally honest about our country, about these institutions that we have now, I think is an important point, because I think if we don't have those honest conversations, then we're not actually getting at the truth of the matter and what we can do to move forward.
Okay, I want to thank all of you for being with us this evening, and our audience for listening. These are difficult and heated questions, and you've provided a great diversity of opinion for people to think about and hopefully respond in their own way. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you.